The sea is silent, 50 meters below the frigid waters of the Sea of Okhotsk. No sonar pings, no engines hum. Just silt and darkness and something else. Something man-made. A shadow glides across the ocean floor. It's not a torpedo, not a mine. It's a diver. Encased in a cold water suit, barely visible against the sediment, he moves with deliberate care. Every inch of motion is trained, rehearsed, lethal in precision. And he's not here to attack. He's here to listen. It's 1971. The diver belongs to the U.S. Navy's most secret undersea program. Behind him, hovering in total silence, is the USS Halibut, a specially retrofitted submarine covered in sonar-absorbing tiles and equipped with deep-sea manipulators. Its mission: reach Soviet territorial waters and tap into one cable. Not just any cable. This was the Soviet Navy's most secure internal line, laid directly between key Pacific Fleet command centers. It carried raw orders, encrypted burst transmissions, targeting updates, nuclear protocols, and it was buried under meters of mud, assumed safe from all eavesdropping. But the diver doesn't care about assumptions. He reaches the cable, gently clears away sediment. From a pressurized container, he removes a metallic pod the size of a large suitcase and attaches it like a leech to the cable's exterior. It doesn't interrupt the signal. It doesn't disrupt flow. It simply listens and records. No one in the Kremlin notices. No Soviet sonar picks it up. And over the next 10 years, it will quietly collect tens of thousands of hours of Soviet command traffic word for word. No radar was evaded. No missile fired. No border crossed. And yet, with a single wiretap, the United States had penetrated the Soviet nuclear command network deeper than any spy or satellite ever could. It was the perfect operation, until it wasn't. This is the story of Operation Ivy Bells, the most daring undersea espionage mission of the Cold War. A tale of secrecy, betrayal, and the terrifying moment when Soviet commanders realized the Americans had been inside their nuclear brain the entire time. The weapon wasn't a bomb. It was a cable. Deep in the bowels of the Soviet Ministry of Defense, behind vault doors and red-starred corridors, sat a room filled with blinking lights, landline consoles, and thick, analog encryption equipment. To outsiders, it looked like a relic, but to the Soviet High Command, it was something else entirely. Untouchable. This was the nerve center of the Soviet Pacific Fleet's command and control network, a system designed not just to issue orders, but to survive World War III. When nuclear missiles flew, this network would still function. That was the belief. That was the assumption. And that assumption governed every decision they made. They didn't trust radio. They'd seen NATO scramble signals, intercept commands, jam airwaves, so they buried their communication literally under the sea. Thousands of kilometers of insulated cable were laid across the ocean floor, threading from Vladivostok to Petropavlovsk, from naval headquarters to submarine pens, landline to landline, copper to copper, encrypted end to end. No broadcast meant no interception. No radiation meant no detection. And the cables ran through their own waters, territorial waters, waters they believed were untouchable by American technology or submarines. And on paper, they were right. American planes couldn't get within 200 miles without a Soviet radar seeing them. U.S. Surface ships were shadowed from the moment they entered the Sea of Okhotsk. Soviet boomers, nuclear missile submarines, sat under the ice, waiting for the signal that would only come through these cables. So the assumption was simple, arrogant, and absolute. No one could touch the wire. The irony was brutal. In avoiding one vulnerability radio interception, the Soviets had created another. By placing all their trust in physical cable, they created a single point of failure. And worse, they treated it as if it couldn't fail. Even the KGB believed it. A 1,969 internal report boasted that American technical capabilities in deep-sea penetration remain confined to surveillance, not intervention. Translation: they don't have the tools to tamper with our lines. But the CIA knew better, and so did the NSA. While Soviet strategists congratulated themselves on their impenetrable network, a different kind of strategist, one in a soundproof room in Fort Meade, was listening in and hearing exactly what the Kremlin never wanted revealed. Because the Americans didn't need to crack the encryption, they were recording it from the source. The most sensitive military system in the Soviet Union wasn't broken from the outside. It was silently entered from below. The Soviet Union's nuclear doctrine wasn't built on speed. It was built on control. Unlike the United States, which delegated launch authority through layers of regional command and pre-coded fail-safes, the Soviets insisted that every decision, every ignition, and every launch signal pass through a centralized command structure all the way to the Politburo. That made communications not just important, they were the spine of the entire Soviet nuclear arsenal. To protect this system, the USSR embedded its most vital communication links in physical infrastructure, hardened underground bunkers, buried landlines, and most critically, undersea cables. These weren't just wires, they were arteries through which orders would flow during Armageddon. The logic behind it was chilling and elegant. If NATO launched a surprise first strike, only a handful of Soviet command bunkers would survive. Those bunkers had to issue orders to retaliate. And they had to do it without jammable signals, without open-air broadcasts, without risk of interception. So they buried their wires beneath oceans, mountains, and tundra. A missile officer in Kamchatka? He'd receive his launch code through the cable. A submarine under ice in the Pacific? Same cable. A backup base in the Urals preparing for second strike contingency? Still the same cable. And because it was all physical and presumed secure, Soviet engineers became complacent. Encryption wasn't rotated aggressively. Voice traffic was recorded side by side with message traffic. Even administrative chatter, ship schedules, fuel requests, personnel complaints ran alongside top-level launch readiness reports. It was all bundled together, passed through the same conduit. The Soviets believed they were creating resilience, but they were doing the opposite. They had concentrated all their communications, strategic, operational, even political, into a single system. If that system failed, if it was breached, then not only would their missiles fail to launch, but their generals wouldn't even know it had happened. And worse, they wouldn't know what the Americans knew. That wasn't just a vulnerability. It was a doctrinal time bomb. The moment the Americans tapped that cable, the entire Soviet nuclear strategy based on uninterrupted command flow began to collapse. They just didn't know it yet. The Soviet cable lay buried under meters of silt in the Sea of Okhotsk, protected by geography, secrecy, and hubris. It was never meant to be found, much less touched. But in 1971, a submarine slipped into those same waters with no intention of following Cold War rules. Its name, USS Halibut. On the surface, Halibut was a relic, a diesel-electric submarine repurposed from ballistic missile duty. But inside, it had become something entirely different. Outfitted with deep-sea manipulation arms, precision sonar, photographic gear, and diver lockout chambers, it had been transformed into a floating spy lab. Its mission: tap the Soviets' most secure military cable without detection, and do it without ever cutting the line. The cable had first been located by the USS Parsha, using towed sonar to map anomalies along the seabed. Then Halibut was sent in to do the unthinkable. For weeks, it scouted the area under absolute radio silence, navigating along the Soviet maritime boundary, avoiding sonar nets, and patrolling destroyers. The tap itself required more than stealth, it demanded surgical precision. At 400 feet depth, Navy divers exited the submarine and began the slow, silent crawl toward the cable's predicted location. The water was near freezing, visibility almost zero. One wrong move could snag a diver, or worse, trigger a Soviet tripwire they didn't even know existed. Then, they found it. A fat, rubberized copper cable, roughly 2 inches thick, resting like a sleeping python along the seabed. The divers didn't touch it directly. Instead, They retrieved a sealed metallic pod code named the Jellyfish and gently clamped it over the cable's outer sheath. The tap didn't pierce or break the wire. It simply used magnetic induction to record the electrical pulses moving through the line. No interference, no interruption, just a perfect, unbroken stream of Soviet command traffic, flowing straight into an American recorder. Then they left. The pod remained, sealed, silent. Every few weeks, Halibut or one of her successors would return to swap out the recording cartridges, pulling encrypted Soviet orders and replacing them with fresh tape. For nearly 10 years, no one in the Soviet Union had any idea. In Washington, when the first tapes were played back at NSA headquarters, analysts stared in stunned silence. They weren't just hearing chatter, they were hearing strategic movement orders, launch rehearsals, internal panic drills, and even missile targeting updates. The operation had succeeded. The cable was alive, and it was talking. And the Soviets? They were whispering secrets into America's ear, without ever knowing it. The first hints were faint. A delay here, a distorted transmission there. In 1973, a Soviet submarine base near Petropavlovsk reported unusual signal lag in one of its encrypted cable channels. Engineers ran diagnostics, but nothing stood out. The lines functioned. Encryption protocols activated. There were no outages. It had to be atmospheric noise, or operator error, or perhaps aging Soviet relay stations. That was the comfort Moscow told itself. In the fortified halls of the General Staff, no one wanted to consider the alternative that the Americans had physically reached into their backyard, slipped under their sonar, and planted a listening device inside their most sacred military conduit. To the Soviet command, such an intrusion was impossible. It was an act of technological heresy. After all, the Sea of Okhotsk was a closed sea. It lay entirely within Soviet territory, ringed by Russian coastlines and constantly patrolled by the Red Fleet. Official naval doctrine insisted that any attempt to infiltrate it would be immediately detected and countered. Minefields, hydrophone nets, regular destroyer sweeps, even trained sonar whales. The idea that an American submarine could sneak in, undetected, was dismissed as paranoia. Besides, U.S. submarines, while fast, weren't believed capable of fine manipulation in deep-sea conditions. They were hunter-killers, not surgeons. The KGB wasn't convinced, but it didn't matter. In meetings with the Ministry of Defense, internal security officials raised the theoretical risk of cable compromise. They were overruled. The argument was bureaucratic and fatal. Defense officials believed that to question the sanctity of the cable system would be to question the core of Soviet nuclear deterrence. So they did what empires always do when faced with unthinkable truths. They ignored them. They increased encryption cycles. They rerouted less important traffic to alternate lines. But they never inspected the cable itself, not at the sea floor. They never looked for taps. The notion that the Americans could extract that much data from under Soviet waters for years without detection? Absurd, delusional. But it was real. And in the silence that followed every message the Kremlin sent across that wire, deep under the sea, a U.S. recording device captured it all, pulse by pulse, byte by byte. While Moscow clung to its doctrine, the Americans rewrote the rules, and the clock was ticking on how long the lie would hold. By 1975, Soviet signals analysts had gathered enough irregularities in their Pacific Fleet's command network to warrant an internal review. Messages were being delayed by milliseconds, barely noticeable, but persistent. Packet integrity checks were showing occasional mismatches. Cryptographic timestamps seemed out of sync. Still, no one raised the alarm. Instead, the blame shifted to a more comfortable culprit: encryption drift. Soviet crypto officers proposed that the anomalies weren't due to tampering but to aging key management systems. The encryption devices used for military cable traffic had been developed in the 1960 seconds. Their timing modules weren't aging well. Synchronization errors were bound to occur. A logical explanation: a safer one, so the recommendation came down. Upgrade the hardware. Replace encryption units. Rotate keys more frequently. Develop a new standard for secure cable transmission. Everyone nodded. Problem solved. Except it wasn't. The Americans didn't need to break the encryption. The NSA already knew they couldn't. Soviet crypto was too tight, even for Fort Meade. But it didn't matter, because the tap was upstream of the encryption, positioned where raw, unencoded speech and data pulses were still being transmitted from naval headquarters. The theory of encryption drift was wrong not because it misread the symptoms, but because it misunderstood the disease. This wasn't a software issue, it was a physical breach. And so the Soviets doubled down. New encryption units were installed in 1976 across the Pacific Fleet. Engineers were rotated. A special commission from Leningrad reviewed cable relay integrity. Dozens of technicians were interviewed. But no one went to the seabed. No one ordered a physical sweep of the undersea cables, because doctrine insisted it wasn't necessary. The cable was too deep. The Americans weren't capable. Besides, if they had tapped it, surely there would be evidence, some trace, some electromagnetic disturbance. Something. But there was nothing. Because the Americans weren't just eavesdropping, they were listening perfectly. As the Soviets scrambled to protect what they thought was an encryption failure, the NSA sat back and watched the greatest signals intelligence haul in Cold War history continue, uninterrupted. The wrong theory didn't just fail to stop the breach. It made the breach stronger because it diverted every Soviet response away from the truth. By the late 1970 seconds, the Soviets had a new explanation. The anomalies weren't mechanical. They claimed they were atmospheric. Solar interference, geomagnetic storms, thermal variation in undersea currents. These became the buzzwords in technical memos and internal briefings. Engineers began citing obscure Western science journals to support their claims. They even pointed to NATO experiments in ionospheric disruption as possible culprits. Anything except the truth. This theory, while scientific in tone, had no grounding in operational reality. The cable in question was shielded, grounded, and buried. It lay under cold, stable water, hundreds of meters below any atmospheric event, and still, the theory held traction. Why? Because it kept the Soviet defense establishment comfortable. If atmospheric conditions were to blame, then the Soviet system wasn't broken. There was no breach, no enemy, just natural noise. The problem was abstract, manageable, and most importantly, not embarrassing. So new layers of insulation were proposed. Redundant cable paths were considered. Signal amplifiers were installed in junction points along the Pacific Line. Technical teams ran diagnostics, documented minor improvements, and declared incremental success. But the Americans weren't slowed by insulation. They weren't tapping the signal in the air, they were catching it at the root. Before any amplification, before encryption, before noise, the second wrong theory, like the first, offered the illusion of control. It let Soviet leadership believe they were responding to a technical problem, not a strategic catastrophe. And so the Americans continued to gather data at will intercepts of fleet orders, satellite uplink instructions, nuclear posture alerts, and more. Sometimes NSA linguists would note peculiar chatter. Soviet naval commanders complaining about new encryption delays, technicians blaming the magnetic tides, even fleet admirals theorizing about NATO satellites stealing pulses from the ionosphere. The irony was brutal. The Soviets were misdiagnosing the very data they were sending, while the Americans, who had never touched a Soviet radar or broadcast signal, sat quietly on the ocean floor, collecting everything with surgical precision. And with each new theory, each false diagnosis, the Soviets became more convinced their cables were simply experiencing normal technical growing pains. They weren't. They were being bled dry, one bite at a time. The worst part? The real enemy wasn't the Americans. It was denial. While the Soviets buried themselves in denial, the Americans were busy compiling the most sensitive archive of Soviet nuclear communications ever assembled. The NSA, headquartered in Fort Meade, Maryland, had set up a special decoding and analysis wing to handle the raw intake from Operation Ivy Bells. It wasn't just routine naval chatter, it was gold. Every week, new audio reels were delivered, first flown by covert courier to Hawaii, then transmitted to Fort Meade via secure link. There, teams of cryptanalysts, linguists, and military analysts got to work. The information flooding in was nothing short of breathtaking. They captured real-time Soviet submarine deployment orders, operational training updates, and fuel logistics. They identified warhead transfer schedules between storage sites and missile platforms. They mapped Soviet second strike protocol rehearsals, complete with fallback command center activations. And most critically, they heard conversations that revealed how Soviet leadership viewed American nuclear posture. Fear, overconfidence, doctrinal confusion, it was all there, in the voices of real officers, not filtered through propaganda. It was like reading the enemy's mind from inside their own command system. In one tape, a fleet commander discussed delayed ignition drills for launching SSN-6 missiles, information the CIA had only guessed at. Another revealed previously unknown alternate command sites hidden in the Far East, sparking an urgent White House re-evaluation of first strike survivability scenarios. The implications were staggering. By 1977, NSA assessments attributed over 34 revisions to U.S. nuclear targeting doctrine directly to information gained from the cable tap. This wasn't just espionage. This was strategic manipulation. The U.S. wasn't reacting to Soviet doctrine anymore. They were shaping it through deep insight and early detection. Yet the Soviets were completely unaware. Their own signals remained clean. Their cable still hummed. Their encryption protocols still checked out. No alarms were tripped. No counter-submarine operations launched. And so the Americans pushed further. New tapping devices were tested. Remote data pods were deployed to allow for longer missions without diver retrieval. Even proposals to tap additional cables in the Barents Sea were floated. But success bred risk. By the end of the decade, the operation had expanded beyond its original scope. More people were read in. More analysts had access. Compartmentalization weakened. The danger was no longer technical, it was human. And in that sliver of vulnerability, a traitor would emerge. Not in Moscow, but in Maryland. At first glance, Operation Ivy Bells looked like a Navy success story. And it was. But the truth ran deeper. It was the product of a fusion. The NSA, CIA, U.S. Navy, and even elements of DARPA working together to build a system no Soviet planner ever anticipated. A seamless, silent, and scalable infrastructure for real-time wiretapping at sea. The origin point was 1968, shortly after the USS Scorpion was lost. During the investigation, naval engineers realized just how much the U.S. had underestimated Soviet undersea detection capabilities and how much more the Americans would need to stay invisible. That failure birthed a new class of operational design, covert signal capture submarines. The USS Halibut was the prototype, but it was quickly joined by a more powerful cadre: USS Parche, USS Seawolf, and USS Richard B. Russell, each specially modified with diver lockout chambers, manipulator arms, and advanced sonar mapping arrays. These boats became the ghosts of the Cold War, roaming near Soviet shores, operating under total silence. Their targets weren't ships. They were cables. To handle the torrent of captured data, NSA set up a black project within its SIGINT Operations Directorate. There, linguists worked in 24-hour shifts, decrypting, translating, and annotating everything, cross-referencing intercepted cable traffic with satellite imagery, human, and even defectors' testimonies. The CIA's Directorate of Science and Technology, meanwhile, helped develop the actual tapping device. The final design was a marvel. Non-invasive, magnetically coupled to avoid signal degradation, with weeks of onboard storage and remote sensor capability. It was, in essence, a black box for the enemy's most vital artery. Inside the system, Analysts weren't just listening to conversations, they were predicting doctrine shifts. When a new submarine class was mentioned in test orders, the NSA tipped off naval intelligence. When changes to missile alert cycles were recorded, Strategic Air Command adjusted its DEFCON posture, all without alerting the Soviets. One declassified memo described Ivy Bells as the most complete intelligence window into Soviet nuclear warfare posture ever attained in peacetime. It reshaped nuclear diplomacy. In arms reduction talks, the U.S. negotiated from a position of near-perfect clarity, while the Soviets operated half-blind. But it wasn't just intelligence. It was also a doctrinal contrast. The Soviets relied on rigidity. Single cables, fixed command lines, encrypted but centralized. The Americans, by contrast, leaned on agility and integration: submarines, satellites, intercepts, and AI-assisted decryption working in concert. It was two philosophies in collision, and for nearly a decade, one side was reading the other's playbook in real time. But systems don't stay secret forever, especially not when humans are involved. In 1980, a man walked into the Soviet embassy in Washington with the entire Ivy Bells operation in his head and a price tag of $35,000. His name: Ronald Pelton, NSA employee and traitor. The fallout began not with an explosion, but a quiet arrest. On the 25th of November, 1985, FBI agents surrounded Ronald Pelton outside a Baltimore diner. He was calm, cold. After years of selling classified intelligence to the Soviets, he had finally been caught thanks not to American sleuthing, but a defected KGB agent named Vitaly Yurchenko, who whispered Pelton's name during debriefings in Vienna. But what Pelton gave away before his arrest was catastrophic. Over the course of several meetings in Vienna and Washington, he had divulged the full existence and operational methods of Operation Ivy Bells. He even described the tap itself, how it worked, where it was placed, how often the Americans came to retrieve its contents. In Moscow, panic erupted. Within weeks, Soviet naval commanders launched emergency seabed inspections. Divers were dispatched to key segments of the Pacific Fleet's command cable, and there it was, a metallic pod, caked in years of marine life, still attached. Still listening. They had been compromised for a decade. What followed was a purge. Security officers demoted, commanders reassigned, engineers interrogated. The KGB unleashed a wave of counterintelligence operations, targeting anyone remotely associated with cable security. Dozens of lower-ranking officers were quietly dismissed under disciplinary reviews. But the true damage couldn't be erased. The Americans had not just listened, they had used the intelligence. They had adjusted targeting, shifted fleet positions, preempted Soviet naval drills. It wasn't just eavesdropping. It was doctrinal sabotage. Soviet pride already fraying from economic stagnation, and the war in Afghanistan took another blow. The Pacific Fleet, once viewed as the USSR's most secure strategic command, had been infiltrated without a shot fired. And, worst of all, the Soviet Union had learned about the breach from a traitor, not from their own countermeasures, not from detection, not from sonar or cable diagnostics, but from an American walking into their embassy, offering betrayal for cash. In the West, news of Pelton's arrest was kept quiet at first. But when the details emerged in court, the world learned just how deeply America had penetrated its rival. The media dubbed it the Cable War. In truth, it was a battle that had already ended, and the Soviets had lost, without ever knowing they were in a fight. The tap was removed, the cables replaced, but the scars remained. A Cold War superpower had been caught blind, deaf, and exposed not by bombs or satellites, but by a diver, a recorder, and a single wrong assumption. It wasn't a military defeat. It was something worse. It was humiliation. In the aftermath of the Ivy Bells revelation, the Soviet Union was forced to confront a reality it had long denied. Its strategic communication backbone, its pride, had been utterly vulnerable and exploited for over a decade. That wasn't just a tactical problem. It was an ideological implosion. The USSR's entire nuclear command system had been founded on one principle: centralized control equals invincibility. Command flowed top-down, encrypted, monitored, and redundantly reinforced, but always through a handful of physical channels, cables, and nodes. That system, designed for resilience, had in fact been a fatal bottleneck, and now they knew. As the Politburo absorbed the magnitude of the breach, the KGB launched an internal review. It concluded what NSA analysts had already known: the Soviet system was fragile by design. It relied on secrecy, not adaptability. And in an age of rapid technological change, secrecy alone wasn't enough. In response, the Soviets tried to pivot. They accelerated development of newer satellite-based communications. They deployed more mobile command posts. Encryption protocols were hardened, spread across more dynamic networks. But it was too late. Because the trust had been shattered from within, commanders no longer believed their orders were private. Submarine crews questioned whether they were being tracked. Strategic missile teams second-guessed whether their fallback orders were compromised. Fear spread not of an American attack, but of their own system failing silently again. And this rot seeped into the ideology itself. The Cold War wasn't just a standoff of weapons. It was a contest of worldviews. The Soviet Union believed in centralization, control, and vertical command. But the Ivy Bells scandal proved that those very structures, when infiltrated, turned into liabilities. Meanwhile, the Americans thrived on decentralization. Their command structure allowed for distributed redundancy, with flexible fail-safes and layered communications. The very chaos the Soviets mocked was what made the Americans harder to break. The breach wasn't just one of secrecy, it was one of doctrinal superiority. By 1985, as economic pressures mounted and military morale sagged, the USSR entered a phase of strategic introspection. Gorbachev's reforms, perestroika, and glasnost weren't just economic or political. They were born from a sense that the old Soviet way had failed. The system wasn't just inefficient, it had been penetrated. The Ivy Bells cable tap didn't trigger the collapse of the USSR, but it revealed just how hollow the Soviet war machine had become. From the inside out, today, the sea is silent again. The cable that once carried the heartbeat of Soviet nuclear command lies in pieces, decommissioned, forgotten, buried under decades of silt. The tap is long gone. The submarines that carried the divers now rest in naval museums or scrapyards. The agents, the linguists, the traitors, all shadows of another era. And yet, the echo remains. Operation Ivy Bells has become one of the most legendary covert missions in modern history, not because of explosions, or assassinations, or dramatic escapes, but because it listened, and in that listening, it laid bare the most dangerous illusion of the Cold War: that secrecy is security. What the Soviets never understood until it was too late was that the battlefield of the Cold War wasn't always visible. It didn't always flash on radar or roar across skies. Sometimes it hummed softly beneath the ocean floor, in the vibration of a copper wire, in the whispers of men who believed no one could hear them, but someone did. And that quiet war changed the course of history. Today, the legacy of Ivy Bells endures not just in intelligence circles, but in every modern cybersecurity protocol, every encrypted satellite link, every doctrine that assumes, if you can be breached, you will be. Because the lesson wasn't just about cables, it was about assumptions. And somewhere, deep in the archives of Fort Meade, in a classified vault, are thousands of hours of Soviet voices frozen in time, unaware they were being recorded by a diver who reached further into their system than any missile ever could. They weren't silenced by warheads. They were silenced by a wire,